Hello everybody, and welcome to a Magic the Gathering level up video. In this video I am going to be discussing how to evaluate cards with an eye towards limited, and I am going to be using examples from Kaldheim, which has not yet released, and talking about some of those cards so that I can show you how I evaluate cards that have not yet seen any play, and you can get some insight into that process. Before I dive in though, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with any questions or feedback. Without further ado, let's dive on in. In this guide, I am going to be discussing basic principles of card evaluation, techniques for card evaluation, specifically focusing on the 3 C's of comparison, cookie cutter, and context, and finally I'm going to be covering some traps, and we're going to be wrapping all of this together with examples so that you can see exactly what I mean when I am discussing these principles. Okay, so what are some basic principles of card evaluation? First off, stay open to new ideas. Every card evaluation should always be open to change, even if it is a small window of change, maybe up a half grade, down a half grade, or whatever your system is. Maybe it's a points system, but every card evaluation is subjective. There's no like rock solid, this is a 3 out of 10 type card, or this is a B rated card. There's always some wiggle room, and you need to stay open to new ideas so that you can be able to pounce on new opportunities or ideas that you had not seen previously. Number 2, power level is relative. This is one of the concepts that may take a while to sink in, but basically if the cards around a specific card are more powerful, you need to demand more of that card. So a great example of this is Vintage Cube, or really any cube, where you might see a card that was fantastic in its normal draft format, but in Vintage Cube it is a medium card. So when you are evaluating a set or a card within a set, you need to make sure that you are evaluating the card within the set that it is in, because some sets are more powerful than others, and so cards can be adjusted accordingly in power level. Number 3, be able to explain your thoughts. This is just generally good with anything in Magic the Gathering, but especially with card evaluation, you don't just want to think, oh, I've got a feeling that this card's going to be good. That's an important first step, but your next level, which is going to help you take your card evaluation from a feeling to an actual actionable step, is to be able to say, okay, I think this card is good, and here is why. And if you're able to explain your thought process to somebody else, even if you have some errors in your judgment, it's going to help you level up your card evaluation immensely when you can think, why is this card going to be good? Okie doke, so now we're going to talk about the 3 C's: comparison, cookie cutter, and context. These 3 methods are usually used in tandem in some way, but I'm going to be going through all of them individually first so that you can understand how to use them in your own card evaluations. So first of all, we have comparison. Here are the steps of comparison. You have a card in the new set that you want to evaluate. First things first, you're going to find a similar card from a previous set to compare it to. That is the nature of comparison. Next, you are going to evaluate the power level of the old card. How good was that card? Are you comparing this new card to a card that was bad? Are you comparing it to a card that was quite good? And third, you're going to analyze the differences. Is the new card better than the old card? Is the new card worse than the old card? How much better? How much worse? What are the similarities? What are the differences? How important are those differences? So, diving into an example. In the new set of Kaldheim, there is a card called Snakeskin Veil. This is a single green mana for an instant that puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it gains hexproof until end of turn. When I saw this card, the first thing I thought of was Ranger's Guile. Now, this card was from 2 sets ago in Core Set 2021. It is the same mana cost, the same type of spell, so it's an instant, and it gives almost the same benefit, except instead of giving a counter, it just gives a temporary +1/+1. Now, in Core Set 2021, Ranger's Guile was a card that you were okay playing. It wasn't like fantastic, but it was a card that you didn't mind playing from time to time. And Snakeskin Veil is a decent amount better because the counter sticks around. So that leads me to believe that Snakeskin Veil is a card that is going to be a solid playable in the format. Now, this is only a first starting point, but I can use this comparison and the fact that the cards are very similar to come to this conclusion. Let's look at another example. In the new Kaldheim set, there is a card called Frostbite, which is a single red mana for a snow instant that deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if you control 3 or more snow permanents, it deals 3 damage instead. Now, when I saw this card, I thought of another Core Set 2021 card, which is Shock. Now, how good was Shock? Shock was a card that you were pretty happy playing in your any red deck that could afford it, because Core Set 2021 was an aggressive format where you needed to be able to kill their early plays. Frostbite, now you can evaluate what are the differences. Frostbite loses the ability to go to player's face, so it cannot deal damage to a player, but it does have the additional upside of potentially dealing 3 damage, which is huge. Going from 2 damage to 3 damage all of a sudden lets your 1 mana spell oftentimes kill a 3 or sometimes even 4 drop, which means that Frostbite has massive potential if you are in a snow deck, and on the downside, it is going to be a shock level card, which is already a good baseline, which leads me to believe that Frostbite is going to be a strong card in the format. Now, it could be that getting snow permanents is more difficult and you would rather have something like shock, but for the starting point before actually playing with the set, it's going to be reasonable to assume that you can end up with 3 snow permanents some amount of the time. So you can use these comparisons even though obviously they are not exact identical cards. If they were identical, it would be a reprint situation. Number 3 of an example of using comparison is Serulf's Packmate. This is 3 and a green for a 3/3 wolf that when it enters the battlefield, it draws a card, and it also has Foretell, which is one of the new mechanics from Kaldheim. So essentially you can spend 2 mana one turn, and then on another turn you can spend 2 mana to cast the Serulf's Packmate. So this card, when I saw it, immediately brought to mind Jiraga Visionary, which was one of the best green commons in Zendikar Rising, which was the last set. And compared to Jiraga Visionary, Serulf's Packmate gets an extra toughness and gets an extra ability in Foretell. Now, being a wizard was sometimes relevant for Jiraga Visionary, so this is why cards vary from format to format, but Serulf's Packmate being basically a stronger version of Jiraga Visionary, a card that was already pretty good, that was already quite good, in fact, leads me to believe that Serulf's Packmate is also going to be quite good and a strong card in your green decks for Kaldheim. Now, this is just the basics of the comparison approach, and there haven't been a ton of cards spoiled or previewed officially. I only look at the official previews for the sets, because I wouldn't want to rob a content creator of their big moment. But there have only been a few cards officially previewed, but when you're evaluating the cards in a new set, you can use this sort of comparison to say, what card does this remind me of? How good was that card? Is this card better or worse? So for Serulf's Packmate, it's a little bit better than Jiraga Visionary, and Jiraga Visionary was already a good card. Moving on to the next method. I called it Cookie Cutter because it kind of entails using a bunch of different methods to evaluate the card, and here they are. The first one you can use is apply the vanilla test. The vanilla test is essentially pretending that the card has no text other than the very, very basics. So if you're evaluating a creature, you just pretend it's a vanilla creature, and that would be like if you have a 3/3 creature for 3 mana and it has an ability, you just pretend it has no ability. Is that a decent card on its own? You can sometimes apply this to spells. If the spells are overly complicated, you can think, okay, this is essentially going to be a divination or a draw 2 spell or something like that, and the extra effect is just gravy on top. So you can apply it to spells, but it's usually applied in the context of creatures. Number 2, evaluate the floor and the ceiling. This is incredibly important. You need to be able to think, what is the lowest possible bar of this card and what is the highest possible bar? And the next little step would be to evaluate how likely each one is to occur. And the floor and the ceiling approach is definitely something you need to do when you're trying to evaluate a card that is more unique. Number 3, use quadrant theory. This is a tool where you evaluate how good the card is when you are behind, how good the card is when you are ahead, how good the card is at parity, and how good the card is in the developing stages of the game when you're relatively early on in the turns. And that's an approach that was coined by Limited Resources and Marshall Sutcliffe. I highly recommend that podcast if you want to level up your limited game and are a fan of podcasts. I listen to it myself, and it is quite good. And quadrant theory is one of the core concepts from that, so I do want to give credit where credit is due. But basically, quadrant theory is another way you can evaluate cards. So we're going to be diving into some examples from Kaldheim. Here is Spirit of the Alderguard. This card does not really strike me as a large comparison to other cards. Sure, there are cards that I'll read the card first. It is 3 and a green for a 0/4 snow creature. When Spirit of Alderguard enters the battlefield, search your library for a snow land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library, and it gets +1/+0 for each other snow permanent you control. So it's a pretty unique card. How are we going to evaluate this? First of all, we're going to use the vanilla test. Is 4 mana for a 0/4 going to be a good card in your deck? The answer, no. A 4 mana 0/4 would not be good, so the text box has to be relevant for this card to be good. What is the floor and the ceiling? Well, obviously, as we just discussed, the floor is a 4 mana 0/4, which is not good. What is the ceiling? Well, if you have a snow deck where you have snow lands and other snow creatures, you could easily be looking at a 4 mana 5/4, 4 mana 6/4, sometimes maybe even a 4 mana 7/4 in the late game when you have a bunch of your snow lands in play and some other snow creatures. And now we think, what would be the average case? Maybe a 4 mana 3/4 seems reasonable to think about. If you have like 2 snow lands in play by this point and one other snow card, a 4 mana 3/4 could be good if you're in the right deck. Maybe it's a 4 mana 2/4. And then you have to evaluate how good is it to be able to get a snow land card. It can help you splash a color. If you're like trying to splash blue and you have a snow island, your Spirit of Alderguard all of a sudden helps helps you splash your color, which is incredibly relevant. So these are the sorts of things you need to keep in mind with your Spirit of Aldergard. Initially, it looks a little bit on the weak side if you aren't in a heavy snow deck, so it does get a bit of a knock for that, because not every green deck is going to be a snow deck, presumably. But if you are in a snow deck, having a potentially 4-mana 4/4 that draws you a land and gets your other snow cards better because it's a snow creature itself could be quite nice. And then finally, you need to look at it in terms of quadrant theory. If you are ahead, is Spirit of Aldergard going to be good? Well, if you're a snow deck, adding a 4-mana 4/4 to the board is going to really help you. If you're behind, a 4-mana something X4, like some amount of power and then a 4 toughness, could be just the tool you need to stabilize. It also, if you're at parity, it could be a big creature to help you punch through. And when you're developing, drawing that extra land to make sure you hit land drop number 5 could be good. So it does pretty decently on the quadrant theory metrics, assuming that you're able to get it up to a reasonable amount of power. And that's where you need to use multiple methods. You can't just think, oh, vanilla test is a terrible card. You need to think, okay, if I'm going to be building around this, what's the floor, what's the ceiling, best case scenario, worst case scenario, and then you only want to put it in your deck when it is closer to the floor than it is to the ceiling. And I think overall, Spirit is probably going to be a pretty good card. I'm assuming that Snow is well supported, but obviously it's going to depend on how the format shakes out. Moving on to the next card is God's Hall Guardian. This is a really interesting card. It may just be a common, but because of the way it interacts with the foretell mechanic, it does strike me as quite interesting. So on the vanilla test, a 6-mana 3/6 vigilance is not a good card. You want your 6/6s to be much bigger than that. If it was a 5-mana 3/6 vigilance, it would be reasonable, but a 6-mana 3/6 is a bit of a fail on the vanilla test. However, once you factor in the foretell mechanic, it gets significantly better. What's the floor of this card? On the floor of this card, it's a 6-mana 3/6. Actually, the floor of it is the foretell mechanic, because you can always just use the foretell ability. But if you just top deck this in the late game, it's going to be a 6-mana 3/6 vigilance, which isn't great. However, the ceiling is going on turn 2. You play the God's Hall Guardian, and then on turn 4 you have a 4-mana 3/6, which is going to really brick wall an aggro deck, because a lot of aggro decks are going to struggle to kill this. Imagine a red-green deck that has to rely on damage-based removal, and they're all of a sudden dealing with a 4-mana 3/6 on turn 4. Like, that's going to be tricky for them to deal with. Like, even if you have to take turn 2 off to play this card as the foretell, and then on turn 3 maybe you play a removal spell, and all of a sudden you brick wall them with your 4-mana 3/6. That's a pretty high ceiling for a common that maybe is easy to overlook because of its initial casting cost. And it also has potential upside if you're playing a foretell deck. There are some cards that care about foretell that have been previewed already, and God's Hall Guardian can fit nicely into those sorts of decks. So initially, even though it fails the vanilla test, it's not very good on the vanilla test, the foretell mechanic can make it have a pretty high floor in the right matchup. And the ability to cast a 4-mana 3/6 should not be overstated. And then on quadrant theory, how good is it in each metric of the game? Well, if you are ahead in the game, adding a 6-mana 3/6 to the board maybe isn't where you want to be, but it's still going to be okay. I will say on quadrant theory, the ahead category is the least important, and the behind category is the most important, because you want to be able to make comebacks in games that you're not already going to win. If you are behind, a 6-mana 3/6 can gum up the board. It can be hard to kill, and sometimes if you are using the forecast ability, it can be even used as a little bit of a tempo play later in the game. If you've put it down earlier, and then you can use this plus another card maybe, it could be pretty decent. And then so behind it's decent. If you're at parity, it doesn't really help you attack through, but it will help you continue to stall the board if that's something you want. And in the developing stages of the game, it's actually pretty good in your opening hand, because if you're taking turn 2 off to foretell, on turn 4 you get to play your God's Hall Guardian. So that's a pretty reasonable combination of factors, and I expect this to be a card that you see a decent amount in the format. Moving on to Rise of the Dread Marn. I don't normally evaluate rares when I am evaluating cards for a limited format, because in limited you generally don't deal with the rares all that much individually, but because there have been so few cards previewed, I figured I would talk about this one, and it's also a great case of using the ability to use these different cookie cutter methods. So first up, the vanilla test. How does this card do? Well, if you were paying 3 mana to get 2 2/2s at instant speed, you'd be pretty happy with that. So on the vanilla test, if you're getting 2 2/2s, it's pretty good. If you're getting anything more than 2 2/2s, it's pretty great. If you're getting 0 2/2 creatures, it's not great. And if you're getting a single 2/2 creature, it's pretty undercosted, especially because it is situational. So you need to be getting 2 creatures consistently from this for it to be good, and ideally you'd be getting a little bit more. So floor and ceiling, what's the floor? 0 creatures, completely unplayable. Ceiling, maybe 4 creatures. If there's a big combat and 2 sets of creatures trade off, maybe sometimes you'll foretell the card, and then use a removal spell in combination with the creatures trading off, and you'll be able to spend a single black mana and get 3 2/2s. That's really the highest I think you can get is like 3 or 4 creatures consistently, but that's a pretty high ceiling, and it's not that hard to enable. And then what does it do in Quadrant Theory? Well, if you are ahead in the game, you are going to be like probably in good shape with Rise of the Dreadmarn, though in those situations creatures are not trading off as much, so maybe it gets a little bit worse. In parity, the card is deceptively like medium because creatures aren't trading in parity because nobody can attack, and if you are making suspicious attacks with a foretell card face down, they might be able to tell you have it, but sometimes it's going to be really good in parity because you'll be able to trade off all your creatures and then get a bunch of 2/2. So that maybe is one of the spots where it's best. If you're behind, Rise of the Dreadmarn is quite bad because you're not going to have creatures in play to trade off. You'll be maybe forced to chump, or you won't have any creatures in play and you'll just be in trouble. But sometimes it can be exactly what you need because you'll throw a double block on and then you'll end up with a couple extra 2/2s. So maybe that's a scenario where you'll get 3 2/2s from this. And then in the developing stages of the game is maybe where it's at its best, because that's when a lot of players are playing 2/2s and 3/3s and then trading them off aggressively, though at that point maybe you don't have time to play this. So it seems like a little bit of an awkward card to me, but definitely one that has the upside to be very good, especially if you built a deck that either sacrifices its own creatures or kills the opponent's creatures. So that'll factor in, and I think when you play this card it's going to be very good, though you may want to make sure you're playing a deck that's going to be trading off in combat or using removal spells or sacrifice. And one thing you need to note with this sort of card is the exact conditions. It says great for the number of X 2/2 black zombie creatures, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn. So if you are going to be using this card, make sure you read all of the cards in great detail for this sort of thing. Next up, our last example of evaluating cards with the cookie cutter method is Issacka's Chariot. This is just a great example of a card that can maybe seem overly complicated. On the vanilla test, it is a 4 mana for 2/2 green cat creature tokens, and then a 4/4 like vehicle that's pretty difficult to crew. But 4 mana for 2 2/2s is already good. It passes the vanilla test. Next up, floor and ceiling. On its floor, it's 4 mana for 2 2/2s and a random vehicle that's difficult to crew. That's a pretty good floor. I mean, a lot of formats you'll already play 4 mana to make 2 2/2s, and this is significantly better than that. And the ceiling is it just single-handedly takes over the game because they can't block your 4/4 and you're just rolling in a pile of adorable kittens and winning the game. So really it does well on that metric. And then finally, Quadrant Theory. If you are ahead, this thing just takes over the game because they won't be able to deal with it. If you're behind, it gives you 2 blockers to do some things flexibles, and it gives you an extra 4/4 blocker, so just fantastic on defense. If you are at parity, it gives you a bunch of bodies and a potential tool to start chipping in and force them to deal with it. And then if you are if you're behind, it gives you a bunch of tools. If you're at parity, the developing stage. In the developing stage of the game, this is actually very good because your opponent's not going to have their defenses set, so if they can't kill the chariot, it's just going to take over. So this is a fantastic card. Okay, now we're going to look at context as an evaluation tool after looking at those examples. Context, the steps you look at is how does the card line up with the format? This is oftentimes difficult to determine before the set comes out, but sometimes you can do comparisons of toughness. So if there's a 5 toughness creature, are there a bunch of removal spells that deal exactly 5, or are the removal mostly 4 damage, or is there a bunch of deal 3s and there's a 4 toughness creature, so that lines up better? Or are there a bunch of 3/2s, so your 2/4 looks a lot better? Or are there a bunch of 3/1s, so your 1/4 looks better? Those are the types of things you look at when you're evaluating format context. Also, sometimes a format will look faster. All of the 2-drops look really aggressive and really difficult to block, so in those cases, you're going to evaluate card draw a little bit lower maybe. Okay, next you look for synergy in its own color. If a card has synergy in its own color, it gets a nice little bump because it's going to make the cards around it better no matter what deck you end up in. So if you are in a red deck and you have a card that is good with a bunch of the other red cards, it's going to perform a little bit better in all of your decks because there are going to be other red cards when you're playing that card. You next need to look for synergy with other colors. There are some cards that are what are often referred to as secret gold cards because they're only really good with cards of one other color or maybe 2 other colors. So they're not as generically good because if they're only good in a couple of color combinations, they are much less flexible in your deck. So looking for synergy with other colors is important, and some of the cards that are good with their own color and with other colors are especially good because they have just so much synergy. And then finally, is it key for an archetype? There are some cards that they might not look super impressive or they might be medium, but they really overperform in specific archetypes. These could be the secret gold cards, they could be the actual gold cards, and they are sometimes the cards that facilitate an archetype by themselves. There are sometimes build around cards that fall into this category where the card may look medium, but in the format, if you have this card plus all these other cards that nobody else wants, you can end up with a really good deck. So let's look at some examples of this. So for example, Masked Vandal seems like the exact type of card that is really a context-dependent card. Let's look at each metric. How does the card line up? So first things you have to ask is, how relevant is a 2-mana 1/3? Are there a lot of 2/1s running around? Are there a lot of 3/1s running around? Is one power going to be able to trade with things consistently? There is oftentimes a formats where 1/3s are just very, very bad because all the cards are 3/2s, or all the cards are 2/2s that can pump themselves, or things like that. So that could be a really variable. And then there are formats where 1/3s are just perfectly fine. Next up, you look, is the fact that it is a changeling relevant? Are there cards that care about changelings? And then you need to ask, how easy is it going to be to get a creature into my own graveyard? And how many times are my opponents going to have artifacts or enchantments? So synergy in color, obviously the preview season is still in its early stages, so it's hard to see all of the cards and how important it is going to be a changeling, but a lot of the time this might be a role player in your deck where having just a changeling in play makes all of your other cards much better, so you prioritize Masked Vandal a little bit higher. Next up, synergy outside color, similar thing. Maybe some color combinations really care about having changelings. I think blue-green might be a changeling color in this set, and so maybe in blue-green specifically you want every changeling you can get, so Masked Vandal gets a nice boost there. Or maybe and then archetype key, again, as I was saying, that's kind of the blue-green thing I was just discussing. Or maybe there's in some other format, there might be a deck that really just always destroyed your opponent's artifacts, or they gave your opponent an artifact and then you wanted to be able to destroy it, or something like that. So this isn't the perfect example of an archetype key card. The next card we're going to look at is the perfect example of that. But these are the sorts of things you need to be thinking about. How does the card line up with the format? It's not just, oh, this is a 2-mana 1/3, it's therefore bad, or this is a 2-mana 1/3 changeling, therefore it's good. It needs to be, how good is a 1/3? 1/3s vary from format to format. This is what I was saying about Vintage Cube versus a standard set. In Vintage Cube, a 2-mana 1/3's almost never going to be good enough. But also in Vintage Cube, your opponent has a lot more artifacts than they might have in a normal set, so the fact that it kills an artifact might be better. In some sets that are very tribal, being a changeling might be more relevant. If tribal doesn't matter at all, being a changeling doesn't matter at all. So you need to evaluate on those metrics. Next up, we're going to look at Cull, the Forge Master, on these tables. How does the card line up? So when you're looking at a gold card like this, a lot of the times it's going to be a little bit different than the card we previously looked at, the 1/3 in green. With Cull, you need to think, okay, how does the card line up in my red-white decks? Is this the type of card I'm going to want? So with Cull, it's whenever a non-token creature you control dies, if it was enchanted or equipped, return it to its owner's hand, and creature tokens you control that are enchanted or equipped get +1/+1. So red-white looks like, according to Cull, would be a equipment/enchantment themed deck. How many enchantments do I want to play? How many equipments are there that are actually good? If there aren't any good equipments, Cull isn't going to be a very good card in your deck, because then it's just a difficult to cast 2-mana 2/2. So those are the types of things that are really important, because the cards around it are going to matter. So synergy in color, if you're looking at red and white cards that are equipments and enchantments, or other like dwarf matter cards or things like that, those are going to be the types of things that change in evaluation based on whether or not you have Cull, or based on whether or not you have the potential of picking up a Cull. Next is synergy outside color. This is really not a factor for Cull, the Forge Master, because it's just not going to be played outside of its color, because it's not really particularly splashable, but it is more applicable to the 1/3 that we looked at earlier. And next up, is it an archetype key? Is the deck with Cull so much better than the deck without Cull that you just have to snap up Cull early? Is it the type of thing where if you take Cull, then you have the option of picking up these equipments and auras that nobody else wants, so that you can then end up with a great deck? Because in that case, Cull might become a high priority pick, even if it is medium in most decks. It might be so important in the one deck that it's good in that you then have the option of playing a brand new archetype because you have Cull. So those are the types of things you need to think of with the context method. So now we're going to look at some traps that come into play when you are evaluating cards. These are the classics. There are, of course, many traps and pitfalls along the way, but here are the common pitfalls. 1, best case scenario mentality, where instead of looking at the floor and the ceiling of the card, you only evaluate the ceiling and you think, wow, this card is great because in this case, it's going to dominate the game. For example, with the black card we looked at earlier that makes 2/2s when things die, you think, wow, this card is great. I'm going to play it on the board. I'm going to make 4 2/2s at instant speed, and my opponent's going to just die on their turn, or something of that nature. Next is rarity bias. Sometimes you'll see a card, you'll think, wow, this is a rare, therefore it must be good. Oftentimes it'll be, wow, this is an uncommon, therefore it must be better than this common, because otherwise the rarities wouldn't be there. Next up is gold card bias. Sometimes you see a card and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is a gold card. They never make bad gold cards, therefore it has to be great. So how do you counter these traps? One, think of the average situation. That's how you counter best case scenario mentality. You think, in what situations is this card going to find itself in a normal game of limited? Second, cover the rarity symbol. It does not matter what rarity the card is in almost any situation. Sometimes I guess it could matter if there's a card that's like a collect 'em all, like if you every time you play a copy of this card, you get to do something with another copy of this card. But those are almost always commons, so it's not going to really matter for those. But I guess the rarity symbol could matter for those, but in general, you can just cover the rarity symbol. It will not matter for your evaluation of the card. Third, don't assume gold cards are good. It's a classic thing to think, oh, the gold uncommon signpost has to be good because it's the gold signpost uncommon. It makes me want to draft the deck. They don't always hit home runs on their card design. Sometimes the cards aren't as good as they hope, and you need to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's look at some potential traps. Blizzard Brawl is a single green for a snow sorcery that says choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. Then those creatures fight each other. Okie doke. So it is a snow removal spell for a green deck potentially. What is the average situation? So if you are in a situation where you have a big creature, you're going to be able to use your Blizzard Brawl to just take out a smaller creature that your opponent has. So if you have a 4/4, you'll be able to kill their 3/3. The average situation, maybe you have similarly sized boards. So your opponent has a 2/2 and a couple of 3/3s, and you have a couple of 3/3s and a 2/2, and maybe you kill their 2/2 or something like that. So the average situation is you kill a relatively small creature, but you only spent 1 mana, so that's pretty good. But you also expose yourself to the downside of your opponent having a bounce spell or a kill spell of their own in response. So there are a lot of risks associated with this card, so the average situation is not particularly good. Next up, cover the rarity. Sometimes people see this sort of card, they think, wow, this is an uncommon, I have to take this card. But in reality, it's not really powered as high power as some of the other uncommons. It's actually powered a lot more like a common would be these days. So cover the rarity, it does not matter. Third, if it's gold, don't assume it's good. That's not really relevant for this card because it is not a gold card. It is just a normal card. Now, when you cover the rarity and you just think of the average situation, this card looks very similar to Prey Upon. Now, I'm not going to say that it is Prey Upon, because if you are a snow deck, it gets significantly better. But if you are taking this in a draft and you don't have the anticipation of getting snow, then you have to assume that it's going to be basically a Prey Upon. And Prey Upon was a very medium card in a lot of the sets it was in. There were some formats where it was better, some formats where it was worse. But you need to keep that in mind, that the average situation is often going to be Prey Upon, and the little snow benefit is more of extra gravy. So it does help the power level of the card, but a lot of the time it's going to be a Prey Upon. If you can make it consistently good with snow, then the card gets a lot better, because all of a sudden you lose the weakness to opponents having removal in response. Actually, you don't, because they can kill it in response. But you all of a sudden can start taking out their 3/3s with your 3/3s, which is a little bit of a benefit. So yeah, also make sure you do read the cards so you don't think those lines of thought that I just thought, oh, it gives indestructible, so it's immune to removal, but they can just kill it in response still. So keep that in mind. So Blizzard Brawl is not, I'm not going to say it's a bad card, but these are the sorts of card evaluation traps that you can fall in. And just because you fall into a card evaluation trap doesn't mean that you think the card is bad. It just means that the card can be worse than it looks on its surface. Okie doke. Moving on to another example from Core Set 2021. This card has this format has so many good examples, but this is a classic. I just wanted to give an example of gold card bias. The average situation, it's pretty easy to tell with this card. It's usually going to be a 3-mana 3/3. Sometimes it's bigger if you're sacking a creature every turn. So you need to make sure you don't think, wow, this is going to be a 3-mana 5/5 trampler every turn because I'll always have extra sacrifice fodder. Because in that format, you just didn't really end up with a lot of sacrifice fodder. Next, cover the rarity. It doesn't matter that it's an uncommon. It's just, you just have to evaluate as if it's a 3-mana 3/3 with that text. And is that card good? It's going to depend on the format. In that case, it was not particularly good. And third, if it's gold, don't assume it's good. This was a classic where you see the gold card, and a lot of the other gold cards in that set were good, and Direfleet Warmonger just didn't really fit what Black-Red had, because Black-Red didn't have the greatest sacrifice support. And so you look at it and you think, wow, this is the signpost gold uncommon for Black-Red. It's clearly going to be good in my Black-Red deck, when in reality it was just a medium card, because a 3-mana 3/3 is a okay card these days. It's not like anything special, it's not anything to write home about, and the ability didn't come up as much as you would have hoped. Okay, we're putting everything together now because it is best to use a combination of tools to evaluate cards rather than any one individual method. So first, you want to look for a comparison card, and if there is not a comparison, you want to use some cookie cutter methods to come to a conclusion of your own. Then you want to zoom out to see the context of the card, whether the cookie cutter methods are going to be useful, whether the card is as good as it looks, or whether it's going to underperform in that set or overperform. And then finally, you want to double check to make sure you are being realistic and avoid any card evaluation traps. So our first card, we're going to look at Comparison and Context for Tormentor's Helm. Tormentor's Helm is a single red mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to defending player. Now, and it has an equip cost of 1. Now this card looks deceptively similar to yet another Core Set 2021 card, Short Sword. Now the big difference is that Short Sword costs colorless mana to cast, and it does not have the extra ability of dealing damage to the defending player when the creature is blocked. And that is actually important to keep in mind because Tormentor's Helm is a decent amount better if you are in a red deck, because that extra damage can really add up. If your opponent is at a low life total, all of a sudden you can just start suiciding your creatures to deal 1 point of damage. Now, was Short Sword a good card? In Core Set 2021, Short Sword was actually a pretty solid card. You were relatively happy to play it, which might lead many to believe Tormentor's Helm is going to be a good card in this set. However, if you look at this, Short Sword has changed. Now it's got the Dominaria set symbol, because in Dominaria, Short Sword was abysmal. You pretty much never wanted to play Short Sword in a Dominaria. So the comparison can really vary based on which format Short Sword you're comparing it to. And then that's why we apply the context, because the context of Kaldheim is going to determine whether Tormentor's Helm is like Core Set 2021 Short Sword or Dominaria Short Sword. So let's look through our context things. How does the card line up? Well, we're going to have to see, but because a card like this really thrives when there's a lot of small creatures in play. If there's a bunch of 2/2s ramming into 3/3s, then Tormentor's Helm gets a big boost. If it is, however, a set where there's a bunch of 1/4s lining up against 2/5s, or your opponent's going to be playing 4/4s when you still only have small creatures in play, or the format ends up not being about combat, it ends up being about massive card draw and value engines because you're able to stall the game with your big creatures or something like of that nature, or the removal is so good that you don't want equipment. It's hard to say without seeing all the cards and the format playing out, but these are the types of things to think about. Next, is there synergy in color? I haven't seen a ton of the cards yet because the cards haven't all been previewed, but there looks like there might be a equipment/auras theme in red-white, because we did look at that call card earlier that did care about having equipment. So if there's synergy in color, then that could really be a boost for Tormentor's Helm, because if you really need an equipment, having a cheap 1-mana equipment can be really beautiful for your synergy. It can help you get your synergy online early and for a cheap cost. 3, synergy outside color. Well, as I said earlier, red-white might be an equipment's aura deck, and so red-white might be a good place to look for your Tormentor's Helm. If it is going to have some synergy, there might be some white cards that care about equipment. And then finally, is it an archetype key? In that call deck, you're going to probably be wanting to play Tormentor's Helm, because it makes all of your other cards so much better if you have call in play and you have a equipment attached to it. So keep those things in mind. It could be really good in a red-white equipment deck, or it could just be good in red decks, depending on how the equipment synergies pan out. Next up, we're going to be looking at Behold the Multiverse using Comparison and Context. So Behold the Multiverse is 4 mana for an instant that says scry 2, draw 2 cards, and it has Foretell for 1 and a blue. Now, here is some cards from the past year of Magic that we can compare it to. We can compare it to Thirst for Meaning, which was 3 mana to draw 3 and then discard 2 cards unless you discard an enchantment. So similar, instant speed card draw. It doesn't have the Scry 2 attached, but it is similar, and Thirst for Meaning was a solid card in its format. There is Of One Mind, which is a 3 mana draw 2 that had some cost reduction built in from Ikoria. And that card was very good in certain decks in Ikoria and pretty reasonable in other decks. So Behold the Multiverse is similar in that way, because it also can be cast for a cost reduction sometimes, or to spread out the mana. Frantic Inventory is kind of like Behold the Multiverse. It's an instant speed card draw spell. Once you start casting multiples of it, if you cast 2 Frantic Inventories, then you've essentially built your own Behold the Multiverse. But it is significantly worse. There were decks that wanted Frantic Inventory, but it's a lot worse than Behold the Multiverse. And then finally, Field Research from Zendikar Rising. These are all of the blue card draw spells that we've seen in the past year. Most of them were actually pretty reasonable in their formats, so Behold the Multiverse could have potential to be good in its format as well. Now we have to look at, how does the card line up? Well, is 4 mana going to be a key turn in the format? Are there going to be other cards you can spend for 4 mana? One thing that you have to know is, how fast is the format going to be? Am I going to have time to draw cards? Am I going to be actively looking to draw cards? Is this a format where drawing cards is really important? These are the types of things we can't really know yet, but we can know a little bit about synergy in color, because we have seen some other blue cards, and the Foretell mechanic is one that works especially well with instants that synergize with each other. So for example, there is a counter spell that also has Foretell for 1 and a blue, and so you can then on turn 2 potentially play your face down card, and then in future turns you play another foretell card, and then your opponent never knows whether you have a counter spell or your Behold the Multiverse or things like that. So if you have other cards that have foretell, that's going to give you synergy with Behold the Multiverse, because your foretell card could be any number of things. Another thing you need to look at is, are there expensive blue instants that fulfill different roles? There is a 4 blue, I think 5/6 creature that has flash in blue, and so if you have that sort of card, you can do something like hold up 6 mana to play that, or Behold the Multiverse, depending on what your opponent does. Usually you would play the 5/6 creature potentially, but you might want to play Behold the Multiverse for some reason if you need to dig for a removal spell or something of that nature. So synergy in color could be important. Synergy outside of color, I think blue-white might be a foretell deck based on the gold uncommon that's been previewed, but there could be multiple different foretell decks, and Behold the Multiverse could have synergy with other cards that trigger on foretell or things like that. And then finally, is it an archetype key? That's similar. Is it the type of thing where if you're playing a foretell deck, you just want anything that says foretell on it? Is it the sort of thing where you really need instant speed spells? There are some formats where drawing 2 cards is really important. So like drawing your second card on a turn is really good, or casting instants on your opponent's turn is good. Think Theros Beyond Death for casting spells on your opponent's turn being relevant, and I believe it was Ikoria that rewarded you for drawing a second card every turn. No, it was Throne of Eldraine that rewarded you for drawing a second card every turn. So these are the types of format things that can really make a card a little bit better if it's a key card for an archetype. Moving on, now we're going to be looking, instead of comparison and context, we're going to be looking at cookie cutter and context, because we're going to be looking at cards that are a little bit more unique. So we're looking here at Hagi Mob. I don't really know how to pronounce the card yet. I'm going to go with Hagi Mob, which is 4 and a red for a 5/4 with the new mechanic Boast, which means when it attacks, it says activate this ability only if this creature attacked this turn and only once each turn. So you can pay 1 and a red to deal 1 damage to any target. So looking at some cookie cutter ways of evaluating it, the vanilla test. A 5 mana 5/4 is reasonable. It's not terrible, it's not great, but you generally want a little bit more for your card. Next, floor and ceiling. Well, the floor is a 5 mana 5/4. That's pretty much the way it works with a lot of creatures, is the floor is the creature, which is reasonable. You're not going to be disappointed playing that. And the ceiling is a 5 mana 5/4 that's killing your opponent's creatures when it attacks, or maybe a 5 mana 6/4 because you're dealing damage to the opponent. So the ceiling isn't that much different from the floor, though if your opponent has a lot of 1 toughness creatures, it gets a lot better. Next up, quadrant theory. Well, if you're ahead, this card is going to hit your opponent pretty hard, so you're pretty happy with it. If you're behind, it's going to be a big body, so it's going to be pretty reasonable to play when you're behind. In development, it's really expensive, so you're not really super happy to play it, and the activated ability is pretty expensive, so you're not super thrilled when you're developing. And when you're at parity, maybe it'll help you kill some of your opponent's creatures while trading with some of their others, but it's not too special in any category. Now, looking in context, how does the card line up? If there are a ton of 1 toughness cards in the format, Hagi Mob looks a lot better. If there are a lot of cards that reward you for paying Boast costs, it gets a lot better. If there are cards like 4 mana 3/4s or things that don't really trade with Hagi Mob that are still reasonable to play in the format, Hagi Mob gets a lot better because it doesn't get blocked profitably by those. These are just the sorts of things to keep in mind when you're evaluating a card like Hagi Mob. Next up, synergy in color. Are there cards in red that do well when you are boasting? Are there cards in red that do well combined with 1 damage? Or is there a way to give Hagi Mob Death Touch? Because if you can give Hagi Mob Death Touch, I guess red doesn't really do Death Touch, so we'll go in synergy out of color for that one. But let's just go straight to it. Synergy outside color. If there's a way to give Hagi Mob Death Touch, all of a sudden it just pings something and just kills it, because if you have Death Touch on a card, you just kill it when you ping it. So if there's an equipment in black or something that gives Death Touch, Hagi Mob gets a lot better. If there's an aura in black, or there's another creature that gives Death Touch for a turn or something of that nature, Hagi Mob gets a lot better. These are the sorts of things where you can evaluate a card and say, in black-red, where you have this Death Touch card, Hagi Mob is great. Otherwise, it's not very good, or something like that. And is it an archetype key? Too early to say if there's a boast deck that's built just around boasting, but maybe this is one of the best boast cards at common, and so it could be a key for an archetype. Moving on to another card that uses cookie cutter evaluation and then context, and then tries to evaluate if it is a trap. First, the vanilla test. 4 mana for Inga Rune Eyes is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 that says, when it enters the battlefield, scry 3, and when it dies, draw 3 cards if 3 or more creatures died this turn. So for the vanilla test, a 4 mana 3/3 is decent, but you'd expect a little more. What's the floor and ceiling? So the floor is a 4 mana 3/3 that scries 3, which is pretty reasonable, because at the point of scrying 3 cards, it's pretty similar to drawing a card, in that if you really need, like, you're just digging so deep in your deck for the cards that you need that it's pretty reasonable. So it's like almost like drawing a card, which is just a pretty reasonable body. And the ceiling is a 4 mana 3/3 that scries you 3 and then dies into drawing 3 cards, which is a fantastic addition to your deck. So now we have to evaluate what the average use case is going to be for that card, because the way you maximize the ceiling is you want to be able to trade off Inga Rune Eyes and then use a removal spell on one of your opponent's creatures, or sacrifice one of your own creatures to get the third creature, because Inga Rune Eyes dies, another creature dies, and a third creature has to die. So you have to like use a removal spell in response to Inga Rune Eyes dying or something like that, to try and draw those 3 cards, or sacrifice one of your creatures with a Village Rites, which is getting reprinted in the set, for Inga Rune Eyes to die. But that's the way the floor and ceiling works. Quadrant Theory. Well, if you are at parity, the card's reasonable. If it's more likely to have a big combat where the creature dies, or you could potentially attack this into a board, but it's not. And scrying 3 is pretty reasonable, so it's decent in parity. If you're ahead, it attacks pretty well with 3 power, but it's a little bit understated for what it does. It does help you scry into more action, so it's decent on that metric. When you're behind, sometimes you're going to be able to just triple block something, and then everything will die. Though, if you are trying to triple block with Inga, make sure that it's creatures that have to die, because your opponent can just assign all 5 of their damage to Inga or something like that, and so only 1 card would die. So maybe you have to triple block different sources or something like that, or 2 chumps in a block with Inga, but it can be decent if you're behind. And then if you are in developing stages, it's pretty nice because Scry 3 can help you develop your hand. Now, looking at context, how does the card line up? Is the card going to be a are there a lot of 3/3s that it can trade with? Are there ways to sacrifice creatures? Is there good removal? Is there synergy in the color? Is the card going to have, is blue going to have ways to get other creatures to die? Or is blue going to have other cards that care about having other creatures die, so that you can put appropriate priority on things like Village Rites? Next up, is there synergy outside of color? Well, I've already been talking about Village Rites, but that's a way to sacrifice Inga, which can be really good. There's also just removal spells in black, removal spells in red, maybe some removal spells in green, like the fight spell could be really good with Inga, because then you fight the creature, both creatures die, and you draw 3 cards, which could be really good. So Inga Rune Eyes could get some nice benefit from that. And is an archetype key. I don't know if there's an archetype that cares about your creatures dying that is based around blue, but if there is, Inga could be a key part of that, or one of the better cards for that. And then finally, is Inga a trap? What is the average situation? Inga Rune Eyes, if it's not dying into 3 cards, is just basically a slightly better Octa Prophet, which is a card from Core Set 2020 that was the definition of medium. It was 3 and a blue for a 3/3 that scryed 2 when it entered the battlefield, and Inga's is only a slightly better version of that if you can't facilitate it. So not really going to be a high priority if the average situation is low, which I guess it's going to be a little bit more format dependent and archetype dependent. So maybe Inga's only good in your green decks that have some fight spells or things like that. That you'll have to keep in mind. It does it if you cover the rarity, you can kind of just see it as if it is an Octo Prophet, and it's not a gold card, so that factor isn't going to come in. So I think Inga is really going to be format dependent about whether it's good, and really deck dependent as well, because card evaluation can depend on the deck that you're in, which is important to keep in mind. And cards that are only good in one deck get a little bit of a knock during the draft portion, because you can't take them as highly for your everyday blue deck. Okay, now here's another card that we're going to evaluate with the cookie cutter context and traps mentality. Divine Gambit. It's a really interesting design. It is white for a sorcery. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment an opponent controls. That player may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. So initially, what do you think? The vanilla test. Well, it's not really a card you can evaluate on the vanilla test because it's so unique. Floor and ceiling. Well, the floor is you kill your opponent's small creature and they put a massive creature into play. The ceiling is you kill your opponent's massive creature and they don't put anything into play. So there's really a lot of swings on that. The important part is going to be finding what the average case is. And then quadrant theory. So let's look at that. If you are in the developing stages of the game, you certainly don't want to cast this. You'll kill something small, they'll get something big. It's the worst possible thing. If you are behind and you kill something big, there's a chance that they won't be able to put anything into play that's meaningful to you. Depends on when you're behind. The later on in the game that you're behind, the better it's going to be. If you're both in top deck mode and they have 2 creatures in play, it's just going to be a hard removal spell. If you are at parity, a lot of the time they're not going to have something better to put into play. That's just the way it's going to work, because they're going to be playing all their best cards anyway. They're not going to have a ton of permanents in hand that they could have played that they're sitting on. And then if you're ahead, killing their blocker so they could potentially put in a big blocker is not great. So it's really, the times it suffers are in the developing stages of the game and when you're ahead, because unless they have no cards in hand and you're ahead, so where it is going to be quite like a good card. So context now. How does the card line up? The important thing to know is, are there going to be a lot of big creatures that just sit in people's hands forever, or are they going to be able to deploy their threats in a reasonable time frame so you can kill them with Divine Gambit? Also, are there decks that are playing big creatures? If every deck is just playing a bunch of 2/2s, then the card's going to be just kill a 2/2, they get another 2/2 or something like that. Next up, synergy in color. Are there ways in white to take advantage of this? Not really, but there could be synergy outside of color, because if you have a card like Mind Rot or a discard effect, you can maybe look at your opponent's hand to see if they have a big creature to put into play before you use your Divine Gambit, or you can make them discard all their cards before you use Divine Gambit. And then finally, is it an archetype key? Is there a deck in the format that cares about making your opponent put permanents into play and then sweeping them away with a board sweeper or something of that nature, though? That's pretty unlikely. Finally, let's look at, is it a trap? So this card was really interesting because when I first saw it, I thought, well, obviously it's a trap because the card looks like it's a great removal spell, and then it just doesn't deliver on that expectation. But the more I thought about it, I think the average situation for this card when you're actually casting it is actually pretty reasonable, because you're not going to cast it on their small card. You're going to wait till they play a 5-drop, and then you're going to Divine Gambit it. And if they have another card, they were going to play it anyway. It's not like other cards that have this effect, where a lot of the times it would be something like you would kill their creature and they'd get a 3/3, or you'd kill their creature and they get to shuffle their library and flip cards until they flip a permanent. This is the type of card where if you're in top deck mode, it's fantastic. If you are behind, you can oftentimes kill the only card you care about, and they might just not have a permanent to put into play. And if you're in the mid game, they're oftentimes not going to have a permanent to put into play either, because they would have already cast it. So I think this is one of those ones that's actually deceptively good, and I think it looks like a trap. So I think a lot of people are going to say it's a trap, but when you analyze it in these filters, you can kind of see, well, if I'm ahead in the game, I'm not going to want to cast Divine Gambit. That's goes without saying, because it gives your opponent a catch-up mechanic. If I'm behind in the game, sure, I'm already behind. If I kill their 6-drop, how many decks run multiple 6-drops? So it is going to depend on format context to some degree, but the average situation should not really impact. Like, the average situation is going to depend on the format, I think. And I think this card actually has the potential to be like a reasonable card to put in your deck. Like, for only 2 mana, you can kill something quite big, and your opponent has to have another card in their hand that is to punish you. So, and also, it doesn't provide them with card advantage, because it's not like they draw a card and then can put a thing into play. They just have to have the card in their hand. And if you're playing a long game where you're a control deck, they're going to run out of resources in their hand, and so it's not going to matter. So I think the card's actually deceptively good. I know I went on a bit of a rant with this one, but I think it's actually going to be a reasonable card. Cover the rarity. Yeah, I don't think I've talked about it being an uncommon, but people can sometimes fall for that trap and think, oh, it must be good because it's an uncommon, but I think it actually could be decent. And if it's gold, it's not gold, so no worries on that. But anyway, that is going to do it for this comprehensive, or somewhat comprehensive, guide to card evaluation. There's always a lot to learn, but I hope, and I'm sure I missed a bunch of stuff, but I hopefully was able to help you improve your card evaluation and provide some insight into some of the Kaldheim cards along the way. If you did enjoy the video and made it all the way to the end, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. Also, be sure to click that bell so you get notified when I post future videos, including more Kaldheim content. And if you do enjoy this sort of thing and want to support my content directly, you can do so via the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. And in doing so, you'll get access to my full card-by-card graded spreadsheet for Kaldheim. So that's another cool incentive for supporting my content. Even $1 a month will get access to that spreadsheet. But yeah, that is going to do it for the video. Leave a hashtag evaluation complete, because hopefully you're ready to venture forth into the world and evaluate some cards now. So leave a hashtag evaluation complete in the comment section to let me know you made it all the way to the end. That is going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.